Well, hello, everybody, and I just wanted to welcome everybody. We've been appreciating you all spending your Wednesdays and now your Tuesdays with us, and we have a couple more sessions after tonight. And tonight we're going to be talking about how comics became comics in the prehistory of comics. I wanted to let you know that tonight is co-sponsored by Jackson College and our local comic shop called Nostalgia Inc. It's been a comic shop in Jackson for over 30 years. Our proprietor was supposed to be here. You might get to meet him later, but check them out. They've got lots of cool stuff, and they are sponsoring this one this evening, so we really thank them. Concatenation Convention is a joint production, you would say, between the library, our Jackson District Library, Jackson College, and then myself, who's just a regular normal guy that got roped into doing all this stuff and loves all this stuff. So with that in mind, and you can see the address down there in the chat that was just put in there. And Stephen was just asking me before we started to let you know that this is going to reference a little bit of manga, and that if you want to see the big thing on manga that we did, you can go to our website and check it out there. And there's several other talks that Stephen's done if you weren't here, weren't able to be here, that are recorded there, and lots of other content from all of our other Concatenation conventions. I'll throw it back to Stephen Tuckey so he can introduce himself, and then we'll hear from our colleague Stephen Albee Scott.
Cool. I'm Steve Tuckey. I'm one of the three people who's tried to put our heads together and come up with really cool events. We're doing mostly virtual events these days for obvious reasons, but I've actually come to really appreciate and enjoy these and look forward to them. I'm a professor at the college. I teach math and science, and my other colleague, he and I have been working on these through the college for a while, and his name is Steve Albee Scott.
Yeah, hello, I'm Stephen Albee Scott, and as Steve said, I'm a professor as well, but you already had heard me introduce myself many times, so I'm just going to say, send it back to John, and John can get us moving.
Cool. Last couple things. We have two more sessions after this, and we'll be giving out some cool signed stuff that Stephen Bissette has so graciously offered us. And later on, I'll put that up on our Facebook so we can see what's left. We know that some people registered and won, so if that's the case, we're going to try to give them to people who did not win, and we'll do that over the last two sessions. You must be present to win. So make sure you show up, and thank you for everybody showing up. Last thing is the questions that we talked about being answered, we're going to try to keep them germane to this topic, because of course Stephen's experience has been extremely wide, so you could ask him a zillion different things, but we're going to kind of keep it germane to this topic tonight. So without further ado, we are so happy to have Stephen Bissette, legendary comic creator, indie comic publisher, and comic guru and teacher. So without further ado, we'll let him lead us through tonight's presentation.
Hello all, and thanks for joining us tonight. It's a great honor to be here with you, and I really appreciate all of you being here. I know some of you are up in the very wee hours or have stayed up into the next morning's hours, so thank you. I also want to mention this is not a digital, these are actual one-sheet posters behind me. I don't know what temperature it is where you are, but here in Vermont, we are at the day the earth froze, and I wanted to make sure you were cognizant of what was behind me, because I didn't want people trying to strain and figure out what is that behind Bisette's head. Tonight's presentation is one of our more academic leaning presentations. This is an overview of the prehistory of comics. And because of the bent of my nature, it tends to focus on some of the more extreme examples of proto-comics, comics that predated the birth of the comic strip in the 19th century. For that reason, some of this involves mature material. I will handle it as tastefully as possible. And without further ado, if the screen share is available, it is. I will load the lecture. Hold on just a moment. And can everyone see the title? Comics Prehistory 1, The Sleep of Reason. Yep. Crime and punishment, sin, yes, death, sir. Demons, and retribution in the proto-comics. Normally I like to face you while I'm lecturing, but my notes are over here to my left. Please do not think I am being inattentive. This is a, at times, note heavy presentation, but I have kept it as entertaining as possible. I do vow to you. You know, when I was a college student, first year art student at Johnson State College in Johnson, Vermont, a college, by the way, that no longer exists under that name. It's still there, but they changed the name and they're part of a conglomerate here in Northern Vermont. I had a professor named Dan Hole, H-O-L-E, and Dan Hole expressed concern over all of the monstrous imagery and horror comics that I obviously had a great affection for. And Dan Hole presented this slide during one of his classes as a cautionary note directed at me. This is from Francesco Goya's very famous Los Caprichos from 1799. The title of this piece, as Dan Hole described it, was "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters." And that's all he said. By the way, let me try something here. Let me give you the title. There we go. Now I'm going to give you information Dan Hole didn't give us. Now, what Dan Hole didn't know is I am a huge fan of Francesco Goya's work, and I knew the full title of this particular plate from Los Caprichos. The title is not just "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters." The full title of this plate is "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. Imagination abandoned by reason produces impossible monsters. United with her, she is the mother of the arts and the source of their wonders," unquote. And you bet your ass in the next class, I had that information. The complete caption stands, to my mind, as a very eloquent summation of the entire comics medium as well, where the most raw, excessive, and primal works, those works that are, quote, abandoned by reason, unquote, hold our fascination with their impossible monsters. Many of the works I'll be showing to you tonight are quite cruel in nature, particularly the journalistic comics that I'll be showing you. They are rendered with primitive clarity in many cases, but once, quote, united with her, unquote, this inventive imagery, the density of interplay between text and visuals, and the calculated expressiveness produces works of narrative art rich in resonant depth and mystery. All right, let's talk about proto-comics, which is a term I and others use to refer to that which is not actually comics, but clearly played a role in the evolution of what became, by the 19th century, the comic strip. This is a detail from a proto-dynastic Egyptian Thinite period hieroglyphic. This is translates roughly as the mace head of King Scorpion. This illustrates, according to H.A. Groenewegen of Frankfurt, quote, an actual historic episode, the ceremonial opening of a canal by the king, unquote. And I'm quoting the book Narratives in Ancient Egypt, Narrative Art, from page 112, published in 1970 by Macmillan. Now, a lot of the hieroglyphs and glyphic art that we look at today, looking back from the 21st century, that may look like picture art or proto-comics to us, were not. Many of these works were actually the equivalent of signage. Often the visual symbols that look representationally illustrative to us were language. This is from about the same period, and this is not narrative in nature. This is a votive victory tablet from somewhere between 3000 to 2778 BC. And according to the same author in the same book, this is, quote, a symbolic statement of the pharaoh's invincibility, unquote. So it's kind of like a Donald Trump billboard, if you will. This is a rare rendition of an actual historic event. And this is not a photograph of a glyph. In much early archaeology prior to photography being adopted, and even after photography had been adopted, many archaeologists would engage artists, or there were many archaeologists who were artists, and they would do like a transcription, a visual transcription, similar to like a gravestone rubbing, if you will. This is identified by Dr. Groenewegen in Frankfurt as, quote, the battle and siege of town in war between the Egyptians and Arabs, unquote. And this is from roughly the 6th dynasty. What's interesting to me with these kind of proto-comics is we can identify these tiers. They're almost like tiers of comic book panels. And because they involve representationally drawn human figures in action, they look even more like proto-comics to us today. Some of this kind of work are in the nature of portraits. So think of them as the Egyptian equivalent of the sort of portrait paintings that you would find in many museums. This is a portrait of King Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti, pictured with their children. I love how representational artists of this period from 1360 to 1347 BC would draw children. They look like little aliens rather than anything that we would recognize as children in our lives. And this is another quote from Dr. Groenewegen in Frankfurt, quote, the pharaoh as a humanized god, King Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti with their children directly under the solar orb of the god Aten. And this was carved into limestone. And I'm going to talk a little bit about tools. Next week's lecture on comics technology is entirely about cartooning tools, and particularly the technology of printing and reproducing comics. This is another archaeological reconstruction of a drawing from a tomb wall relief. This is found in a tomb in El Amarna, New Kingdom. This dates from somewhere between 1364 to 1306 BC. Again, this looks like comics to us, but this is not comics, nor is it proto-comics. This is a portrait of a place, specifically the Palace and Temple Gate. And so again, this is more of a form of either signage or perhaps a map than it is proto-comics. This bas relief from the same rock tomb in Al Amarna, circa New Kingdom, 1364 to 1306 BC, is, however, a proto-comic narrative. According to Dr. Groenewegen in Frankfurt, this is, quote, an isolated instance of space-time narrative in Egyptian art. What this depicts is Mahu, the chief of police, the figure at the left, reporting to the vizier and the princes of Pharaoh concerning the capture of lawbreakers, unquote. So I present this to you as perhaps one of the first crime comics, or at least a crime and punishment proto-comic. War is also a comics genre that dates way back, and we find many, many, many examples that I'll be showing you some of tonight. This is specifically a dramatic narrative from the Temple of King Seti I at Abydos, and this dates from somewhere around 1304 to 1209 BC. This represents the pharaoh defeating Kadesh and Amad, who are the figures pictured at the top, and the Libyans, pictured at the bottom tier. So this is a proto-comic. It is a pictorial narrative, and it's specifically a war proto-comic. The earliest known illuminated manuscripts, and of course, there may be many that predated this, but we only know of the ones that have survived in some form, are the Egyptian books of the dead. These were usually buried with their dead. The intention, as it's understood by archaeologists, was to help the soul pass into the afterlife, and these books needed to be buried with them as part of that ceremonial ritual. Illuminated manuscripts are something I'll be touching on repeatedly in tonight's talk. Now, some of these feature imagery of the soul's descent into the underworld for judgment. And in that way, it could also be argued that these might be among the earliest known surviving religious sequential narratives. And again, I'll be showing you quite a number of religious sequential narratives tonight. All right, let's shift gears to another country, another culture, another place and time. This is the Emperor Trajan and the Trajan columns. Marcus Ulpius Trajanus was the Roman emperor from AD 98 to 117, also known as Emperor Trajan, and he was born in about the year AD 53 in what is now Spain. He was the son of a consul and thus a member of a noble Roman family. He showed such prowess in public and military service that he was chosen by Nerva to be his successor on the imperial throne. Trajan was formally adopted in AD 98 by Nerva, who then promptly died and left this not so young man. He was probably about the age of 45, which was quite old for that time in that culture. He, at that point, became emperor of Rome. And he decided to construct for himself a monument to his glory and the glory of the empire. Now, from Rome's beginnings, the Forum Romanum had been the center of Roman business, politics, and ceremony. It was more than a marketplace. It was sort of like a combination public gathering spot, marketplace, political emporium, arena, and so on. Located at the base of Palatine Hill, just south of the capital, the Forum Romanum was embellished over the years with various temples and other structures and memorials. Caesar, Augustus, and Nerva had each built new structures to the northeast of the old Forum, but still linked to it, and they were each linked to each other by various doors and passageways. And this is where this emperor chose to honor himself. Now, in his time, Trajan constructed this monument to himself. This is his likeness as it appears on the monument. And it was completed in the year 113 AD. It's almost 100-foot tall. It is a marble column. So these carvings, these relief carvings I'm showing you, were carved by artists into marbles. It's set atop a massive rectangular base, and it's topped by a gilded statue of the emperor himself. That's what's up on top of the column. Now, these kind of monuments were usually much smaller in scale. They were not new to Rome. There were, however, three elements that made this particular column unique. There was a chamber carved in its base to house the ashes of Trajan himself. So the emperor's remains were interred in the base of this monument. There was a spiral staircase which wound upwards within the tower. So this was carved in an otherwise solid marble shaft up to a viewing platform at the top. And there was a continuous sculpted frieze which decorated the exterior of the column. And this is a close-up of just part of the column. Now, I have no idea how people were supposed to view this. This is like, there must have been, you know, some sort of platform or scaffolding work, perhaps that was erected at specific times of the season or year. Certainly the carving itself had to be executed over a long period of time by the artists who were doing the carving. And this is a diagrammatic view that I found. This is essentially an archaeological redrawing, a cartoon of the column section. The light green shaded portions indicate major compositional divisions. So let's call them page breaks, if you will. The light purple figures that are highlighted on this cartoon, those are the figures of Emperor Trajan himself. So he appears throughout the narrative. He's the hero of this narrative. The blue squares indicate areas where an object interacts with the upper spiral border. There are solid pink circles which indicate where there were holes drilled for attachments to the column. Again, scaffolding or platforming of some kind. And the empty pink circles indicate areas where attachments were likely planned, but no holes were ultimately drilled. The green triangles indicate areas of carving in the round, fully relief carved figures. And some of the carving work is extraordinary. Now, of course, this is worn by erosion and time. These carvings, when they were fresh, were even more vividly representational. These carvings depict the events of both the Dacian Wars with an apparent accuracy of detail. The wars are shown as a series of vignettes or scenes detailing specific events, from fighting to collecting food, from marching to building, including details of the lands that the Romans passed through and the enemies that they fought during those travels. The figures in the carvings, and this is mind-blowing, there are over 2,000 figures that the artist carved into this solid marble column. They are executed at about 2/3 life size, and they're so finely detailed that they cannot be fully appreciated from the ground, which again is part of the mystery of these columns. Like, how were these supposed to be viewed? How were you supposed to read the narrative, if you will? Or were you even supposed to? Were you supposed to just bask in the glory and enormity of it? This exquisite detail has in fact presented modern scholars with a problem in understanding exactly how an ancient Roman citizen might have experienced the column. We don't know. If you're interested in looking at more images, these photographs that I've shared with you come from this website. I'll leave this up for a moment. And again, bear in mind, this lecture is being recorded. It will be archived. So if you choose to come back to copy down this information later, it will be available for you on the recording. It is phenomenal how many photographs have been taken. And as you can see, there's scaffolding that was erected around the column. You can see it to the right of the photograph here, just to take these pictures. Now, this is the column of Marcus Aurelius. Once one Roman emperor built a column, well, other emperors also had to build bigger columns, better columns, more richly detailed columns. Now, this column was not built by Marcus Aurelius himself, but rather by his son Commodus around 180 to 190 AD. Commodus erected this column to celebrate his father's victories in a war against the Marcomanni north of Rome, what is now known as Switzerland. This is an amazing column, and the carving and the intensity of detail on it is just staggering. It is very much like Trajan's column. However, the art style had changed in the 80 years that had passed between the creation of the Trajan column and the Marcus Aurelius column. And this column has much, much deeper relief detail. This means that the figures, some of them have suffered over the years from erosion. You can see where some figures have lost limbs and so on. But I also want to point out to you an aspect of the evolution we're going to be seeing tonight of proto-comics. This column is much more violent than Trajan's column. So war comics as a proto-genre, or should I say proto-war comics as a proto-genre, were already escalating with the creation of these various columns in Rome. Also, it has to be said that Marcus Aurelius was not as successful in war as Trajan has been. So the narrative is often quite tragic in scope. All right, let's shift gears away from Rome and let's jump in time. We're going to be skipping like a stone over a body of water tonight to touch on a number of proto-comics and points in proto-comics history. This is the very famous Bayeux Tapestry. This imagery is stitched into a tapestry which is 214 feet in length, but it's only 20 inches in width, which kind of makes it a challenge to share the imagery with you in a slide lecture. It was embroidered with a needle using the wool of 8 different colors, and its history reflects something very typical to comics history: revisionist censorship and creative editing. When this tapestry was repaired in 1484 to 1485, it was lined from the back to reinforce and support the tapestry. And the lining was again done in 1730. And then this tapestry was, quote, restored, unquote, by Lambert the Conservator in 1730 with machine-made wool. And Lambert, in his infinite wisdom, chose to alter parts of the tapestry to fit his interpretation of history. So much like reading, a Comics Code Authority approved comic book from, say, 1959, we are never going to know, much less see, the original Bayeux tapestry. We can only see what Lambert the Conservator in 1730 decided we should be seeing. Nevertheless, let's take a look at it. The earliest known record of the Bayeu's existence dates back to 1476. It was found in a list of relics in the Bayeux Cathedral in Normandy, France, hence its name, the Bayeux Tapestry, which has nothing to do with the original intent or the original content or indeed the originators of the tapestry. It was long believed that the tapestry depicted the Norman conquest of England by William the Conqueror, culminating in the death of King Harold at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 AD. In the first third of the tapestry, the death of the reigning King Edward, who is shown here in this image I'm sharing with you on his deathbed, led to the crowning of King Harold, King of the English. And while the bishop, who is shown here in this portion of the tapestry, blessing a celebratory feast, and King Harold dined in Hastings, Duke William of the Normans led his army, quote, manfully and wisely for the battle against the English army, unquote. Another quote from the interpretation translation, quote, here died Leofwine and Gurth, King Harold's brothers. That's them dying at the bottom and top of this tapestry section. Here is Duke William Eustace. Here King Harold was killed. That's a direct quote from the translation. Note that King Harold is killed with an arrow striking him in the eye. This makes it, for those of you out there who are comic book academics, scholars, and fans, the first injury to the eye motif, as Dr. Frederick Wortham would later call it in his 1954 book, Seduction of the Innocent. King Harold, having been struck by an arrow in the eye, which sank into his brain, indeed died. Thus endeth the tapestry. By the way, if you're interested in finding out more, there's a number of reproductions of the tapestry online, which I'm sure you can find with a little looking. This is my favorite book of all the books that have reproduced the Bayeux Tapestry. 1066, The Hidden History of the Bayeux Tapestry. It was published in 2005, but you can still find copies out there. And part of why I love this book is it has fold-out illustrations, reproductions of the tapestry. They do not stretch for 200 feet, though. Okay, let's switch gears and move to another part of the world altogether. Chinese scrolls predate all other known scroll proto-comics. There are no illustrative narrative elements present, but their existence must be noted. And these are the Chinese scrolls that I referred to during the lecture, which is archived, recorded online as part of this series, the lecture about manga prior to Tezuka. These are the Chinese scrolls that I verbally referred to. Now I'm going to show you a few examples. This scroll is unusual among the Dunhuang scrolls in bearing a profusion of impressions of a number of seals. And not the animal, the seal, but, you know, authoritarian stamped seals. The larger seal reads, quote, a secret talisman ordered by the divine lady to put a spell on the evil spirit, unquote. The smaller seal suggests that it is the seal of an institute of government whose work is likely to have been concerned with the performances of meritorious acts, rituals, and prayers for the safety of the state. This is a later Chinese scroll. This is a manuscript written in Chinese on dark blue paper. This dates from the late 14th century. It depicts 17 characters in Chinese book script in gold ink, and a number of miniatures in gold and white, with a frontispiece depicting the historical Buddha, Sakyamuni, seated on a throne surrounded by 9 disciples and 5 bodhisattvas on each side. By the way, this was a concertina folded format scroll. This is not a proto-comic, but I did want to share it with you because it's an early example of a surviving scroll with an illustration aspect to it. This is on thick paper boards. The upper panel is deeply inset, and it features a title flanked by 2 very fine miniatures of the Buddha seated within a stupa, descripted in full color. Here's my favorite, though. You'll know why very quickly. I just wanted to share with you this very cool document from China, from the Sichuan province. It dates from roughly 1643 to 1661. Quote, report of a monster sent to the emperor from EY, governor of Sichuan province. Quote, several soldiers, including Ding Wahu, discovered in Guiduali a beast with a human body but no head, and instead a hand growing from his neck. It has eyes on its belly and a mouth on its belly button. This beast came to the army camp and ate rice, but caused no harm to any people or animals. Later, the soldiers chased him to a place called La Ha Huai. There in the valley, there were many deep caves, and the beast jumped into one of them, where the soldiers discovered hundreds of these beasts, unquote. This was a document that had been kept by the Jesuit scholar Martino Martini, who was born in 1614. He lived in China between 1643 and 1661. And this Jesuit scholar was a geographer, and he prepared the first modern atlas of China. Pictographic languages. Again, these are not proto-comics, even though they look like proto-comics to them. This is, pictography as language. What I'm showing you here is a manuscript on thick brown paper. This is from the Yunnan, China, 18th century. It features 4 lines in pictographic script in certain compartments. And this, again, gives the illusion of panels and panel tiers. But these are language iconography. This would be the equivalent of reading a number of sentences or paragraphs. So let's talk about the birth of manga. And again, if you're interested in this little section, there's much more about this in the full lecture that I gave earlier on in this series. Imaki, picture scrolls, embraced all genres: literary works, religion, biographies, ghost stories, moral tales, romance, myth, legend, fantasies, comedies. They often featured text with very rich illustrative properties. As of 1962, there were some 600 scrolls in all that were known to exist. And it was believed that there were at least another 400 scrolls that may have been lost forever. So we're just going to look at a very few examples because I covered this in detail with the manga before Tezuka. What you see here is an example of a 12th century scroll, and I wanted to present it to you to show you how the scrolls were read. It was culturally understood at the time how to unroll the scroll and how large an illustration section you would reveal. So each roll of the scroll is very similar to how we read online comics today. Online comics, when they were first being introduced, say in the early 1990s, tended to scroll here in North America across the screen horizontally. But I understand now what is favored in digital comics is moving vertically over the screen. Either way, they owe a huge debt to these kind of Amaki scrolls from Japan. Here's a little bit of detail of one that I shared with you during the manga lecture. Scrolls were popular among all classes, from court nobles to warriors to the priesthood and the common people. And many of them are still quite startling. This is the Legends of Shigi-san Temple. And this is the one that depicts the legend of a rebellious flying rice bowl. Yes, that's our hero in the upper left-hand corner. A flying rice bowl that leads an army of bales of rice until pacified by a priest named Myoren, who commands the magical iron bowl to cease its rebellion. This is the Sutra of Cause and Effect. This dates from the 8th century. It is a depiction of the Hanjodan, the previous existence, and the Butsudan, the historical life of the Buddha. The text ran along the bottom of the scroll's illustrative art, and we do not know who the artist is. There were hundreds of scrolls in all genres. The Tales of the Genji was a romantic novel in scroll form. This depicted the life of the Heian period Prince Genji from the 12th century. Ghost scrolls were enormously popular. We find examples among the surviving scrolls from multiple time periods in Japanese history. This particular 12th century masterwork has been uncertainly attributed to an artist named Mitsunaga. This is an image from the similar Jagoki Zoshi, the Scroll of Hells, also from the early Kamakura period from the 12th century. It depicts the various hells described in the Buddhist sutras. And if this imagery catches your eye, there's a terrific early 1960s full-color Japanese feature called Jagoku, Hell, which I highly recommend, but make sure you have a strong stomach before you dive into it. It's an amazing movie, and much of the imagery was adopted directly from these scrolls. The ghost and hell scrolls continued to be popular well into the 18th century. And what's interesting is apparently the longer they existed, the more comical and playful they became. This is a black and white image from a full color scroll, but I could only find a black and white reproduction. This is from Mitsunobu Tusa's imaginative Night Walk of 100 Demons. This dates from the 15th century. A work that scholars claim is completely devoid of religious seriousness, a very playful and colorful ghost fantasy scroll. But there were also war manga. The stories of the Heiji Civil War. This dates from the Kamakura period of the 13th century, and it's comprised of 3 scrolls, which when they're read in order, dramatize the civil wars of the Heian period, starting around 1159 AD. Also from the 13th century Kamakura period was the Kigon Enji, the history of Kigon, artist unknown. This scroll novel presented the biographies of 2 Buddhist prelates, Gengyo and Gisho, who co-founded the Kigon sect in what is now Korea in the 7th century. At one point in the Kigon Engi, which I'm sharing an image with you here from that section, a beautiful woman named Zemyo falls in love with Gisho, but he ignores her to pursue his religious studies. Spurned, she throws herself into the sea, and she becomes his guardian dragon, protecting his ship. Oops. There we go. Now we're back on track. The next step up from the scrolls in popular evolution of Eastern arts were the Ikiyo-e, the pictures of the floating world. These were woodblock prints, and these were very popular from the 17th to the 19th centuries. This evolved into the classical 18th century Japanese woodblock and color prints that many of you have seen at some point in your life, either in museums or books. These were created and manufactured with a remarkable sophistication of technique and print technologies, primarily for the prosperous merchant class during the Edo period from 1603 to 1867. They were still steeped in ancient folkloric mythic images of dread and fear. By the 18th century, woodblock creations such as this one were classics of the form. This is what many Western countries first saw as examples of Japanese art. Some, like this one, recorded and or advertised popular performances of no or nogaku plays, which had been performed since the 14th century, and they were always, of course, performed live. Some of these images also would record or promote the more shocking kabuki theater, which began in the 17th century, first performed in 1603, and the medieval bunraku, the puppet plays. Shunga, pictures of spring, spring being a euphemism for sex, were built upon earlier hand-painted Japanese erotic scroll art. The shunga were a particularly popular form of ukiyo-e among all social groups in the Edo period, despite the disapproval of the shogunate. Almost all the ukiyo-e artists created shunga at some point in their careers without any loss of face. Since shunga sold for a higher price, as erotic art often does, and they also sold more easily, as erotic art often does, to upscale clients, an artist could earn sufficient funds to live comfortably for months on sales of this kind of artwork. The acknowledged master ukiyo-e artist and printmaker of the Edo period was Katsushika Hokusai, and I talked quite a bit about Hokusai during the manga lecture. He was the first great manga artist to become known internationally. The Hokusai manga were published in 15 volumes during the Edo period between the years 1814 and 1878. And those volumes showcased over 4,000 of Hokusai's woodcut prints, depicting everything. From the ordinary, here, men at work. At the top are men making twine, two men making noodles, a customer studied via hand glass by a fortune teller, a seated man using a telescope, a lens grinder, and a trio of umbrella makers. To the extraordinary, this is 2 pages I'm going to share with you showing feats of magic, which are each labeled with a piece of text. Here, vanishing magic, sleeve magic, exhaling bees, vase magic, exhaling a horse, don't try this at home, folks, smoke face, sword swallowing, and creating ocean waves from the palms. Hokusai also loved to illustrate science and nature, observations of the sky, clouds, storms, flowing water, and some of these images look very much like proto-comics, but these were not sequential in nature. These are 4 individual prints prepared as a single woodcut print. Ocean waves, these are all very powerful primal images, beautifully rendered. More fanciful were Hokusai's portraits of, quote, foreign barbarians, unquote, grotesque and superpowered warriors and priests from far-off lands. And if you're a fan of martial arts movies or of Asian fantasy and horror films, Hong Kong, Japan, China, and so on, a lot of the Hokusai imagery fuels the special effects in a lot of the films, particularly the yokai films. Hokusai also drew countless ghosts and demons. Here, Hokusai illustrated the legend of Kasane, the ghost of a murdered, ugly landowning woman who was exorcised in this image by a priest named Yuten. This legend was adapted into many, many forms, most famously via kabuki plays, and later, very popular feature films, beginning in the 1930s in Japan. And there was a whole explosion of Japanese ghost films in the 1950s and 1960s. And of course, many of you will be familiar one way or another with the J-horror phenomenon, more contemporary in the 1990s to the present. But Hokusai's manga, not being sequential in nature, even when they were sequential, they were rarely narrative pieces. These 2 pages were labeled Amaurosis and Blind People. So these are portraits of people that Hokusai drew from life. Some of his funny face portraits were sequential in nature, and these are essentially prototypes for animated cartoons depicting various extreme and grotesque expressions and contortions illustrated over short periods of time in order to show the comic distortions, almost like animated portraits, a cause and effect rendering of action. These are the precursors to the techniques of anime in the 20th and 21st century. Some of Hokusai's multi-figure illustrations were sequential action portraits, like this piece depicting the steps in a satirical dance, the Yaku Odori. And this is one I had shared with you in the prior lecture, an instructional manga. At the top, it shows you how to disengage an assailant when he grabs you by the collar. The middle right, another way to disengage a grabbing hand, middle left. Senribiki, or the 1,000-mile drag, a move used to capture an assailant. Bottom right, how to hold an assailant with one hand. Bottom left, how to prevent that hold being used on you. Again, recommended reading. This is my favorite of the current books in English about Hokusai from Abrams, published in 2007. But the one I grew up with, published in Rutland, Vermont, and Tokyo, Japan, was Charles E. Tuttle's 1958, The Hokusai Sketchbooks. Our local library had this, and that was how I grew up seeing Hokusai's work from a very tender age. Okay, let's switch out again. Another country, another culture. Forgive, please, the anglicized names and terms that I affixed to this section. This is the Mixtec of South Central Mexico. They created painted, colorful, epic sagas on deer hide screen folds that are definitely proto-comics. The so-called Codex Zuchnetal, better known as the Codex Natal, is an accordion-folded pre-Columbian Mixtec masterpiece. The name, and this is why I'm apologizing for the westernized name, the name acknowledges Zelia Nuttall, who first published the Codex in 1902, and that was also the name of its donor to the British Museum, the Baroness Zuch. You see how this works. There are only about 16 known Mixtec pictographic codices surviving in catalog. There were surely many, many more that existed in their day, but only a handful have survived. And all the names we know them by are by the Westerners who ended up owning the material or donating the material at some point in the lifespan of those that have survived. The Codex Zuchnetal was probably made somewhere in the 14th century. It's comprised of 14 sections of animal hide. The Codex folds together like a screen, vividly painted on both sides of the hide. It's one of three codices depicting the genealogies, alliances, and conquests of several 11th and 12th century rulers of a small Mixtec city-state in highland Oaxaca, specifically the leadership of the warrior lord 8 Deer Jaguar Claw, who died at the age of 52 in the early 12th century between 1011 AD and 1063 AD. Now, these are to be read in a very curious way. You start from the lower right-hand corner, and then you go up, over, and down to the left, and then up, and then over to the next leaf, reading it back to front. So this kind of reading pattern doesn't correspond either with Western comics today or with manga as we enjoy reading them today. It's a vivid biographical epic. It depicts the birth of Lord 8 Deer Jaguar Claw. Again, interesting how in this culture artists would represent children pictorially. His many battles, his triumphs, and his death in the year 1063 AD. This codex probably reached Spain sometime in the 16th century. It was first identified at the monastery of San Marco, Florence in 1854, and it was sold in 1859 to J. Temple Leader, who then mailed it or shipped it to his friend Robert Curzon, the Baron Zuch. The Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology of Harvard published a facsimile of the codex in 1902 with an introduction by Zelia Natal, which is now in print from Dover Books. The British Museum acquired the actual codex in 1917, and there is a facsimile on permanent display there at the British Museum. The version that we can buy via Dover Books, the scans that I'm showing you here, are a reproduction of the Codex Natal, not photographed from the actual codex. The Codex Borgian, aka Codex Yoali Ihakuto, is far more mysterious. It is a Mesoamerican ritual and divinatory manuscript traced to what is now the southern or western Puebla. It's believed to have been painted before the Spanish conquest of Mexico. It is one of a group of manuscripts named after the Italian Cardinal Stefano Borgia, who owned it before it was acquired by the Vatican Library. Again, you see how this works. The names affixed to the codices are the names of the people who at some point had acquired them and owned them as property. The codex is made of animal skins folded into 39 sheets. It's peopled by supernatural beings, and this strange, profoundly epic work is steeped in ritual beliefs and practices of its culture that remain very enigmatic. Nobody has translated this with any degree of accuracy. They apparently show a journey, but the complex iconography and the lack of any comparable document have led to a variety of interpretations, ranging from an account of actual astronomical and historical events to others who believe it shows the passage of Quetzalcoatl through the underworld, to others who believe this is, quote, a cosmic narrative of creation, unquote. There are 4 piercing sacrifices shown in this image I'm sharing with you right now. The purpose of the sacrifice, unknown. All right, let's shift gear to manuscripts where we do know what's going on in the proto-comic. Let's take a look at religious proto-comics. And I warn you, some of these are pretty brutal. Western religious art also features many prototypes of comics, comic-like multi-panel illustrations, sometimes sequential in nature, often found in medieval Bibles as early as the 5th and 6th centuries. As Pope Gregory said in 600 AD, quote, "We allow pictures in churches so that men who cannot read can look at the walls and read there what they are unable to read in books," unquote. So graven images became tolerated in Western civilization, even in the most extreme religions. This 6th century Bible page depicts the Passion of the Christ. This is one of the Bibles believed to have been dispatched to St. Augustine by Pope Gregory in order to convert Britain from paganism to Christianity. Still, there was much theological resistance to the use of any Christian representational art. These were considered by the devout graven images. And this resistance opposed any illumination of manuscripts or any use of religious imagery. This led to the destruction of many, many texts that featured images. So all we have left today to study are the ones that survived various purges of the graven images. Still, despite those reservations, many proliferated and survived. Many so-called illuminated manuscripts feature proto-comics amid more traditional use of illuminated letters and illustrations. The Bible's moralities were created to interpret and explain the scripture. A broad didactic movement in the first half of the 13th century was one that placed an importance on pictures teaching morality. These are vital to the evolution of comics. Both the depiction and the text must be read because the images hold an interpretation of the world or that moment in history, and details within the images hold symbolic meaning. In many, each page was designed like a stained glass window, paralleling the text of the Old and New Testaments with illustrations of their moral and allegorical interpretations. Many of these were produced in Paris, France, under the patronage of the French royal family. We even see in some inventive fusions of text and illustrations in these illuminated manuscripts, precursors to captions, and even precursors to word balloons, as in this example from Italy, from somewhere between 1335 and 1340 AD. Such illuminated manuscripts were not strictly Christian texts or creations. This Hebrew illumination from the 13th century is even more proto-comic-like than many of its contemporary Christian illuminated manuscripts. This depicts the religious service of the Haggadah, recited at home on the first evening of the Passover Seder. And here's another. These are very rich proto-comics history. And I could give you examples from almost every religion around the world. Many of them use multiple combinations of text and imagery to instruct and educate. Christian texts of the 14th and 15th centuries demonstrated an increasingly sophisticated, much more illustrative use of sequential imagery. Consider these two pages. This is page 1. I'll show you page 2 in a moment. From the Massajousky Bible, here depicting an Old Testament scene. And here, a New Testament scene. So there's the Old Testament scene, and there's the New Testament scene. The whole is considered a masterwork of Gothic art and points to the more complex integration of text and sequential imagery in future Bibles and religious texts. In terms of Western art, Hieronymus Bosch is an excellent transitional visionary for our purposes here. Bosch's work summarize the medieval religious artist, even as it seems to anticipate the lucid dreaming of the 20th century surrealists. Bosch was essentially a religious artist. He painted many multi-panel religious works, like this one, styled as a circle inscribed within a square, which was geometry common to the mystical tradition of many world religions. And the circle is a panological depiction of, in order, sloth, anger, avarice, gluttony, envy, pride, and lust. Hence the title affixed to this work, The Seven Deadly Sins. By the way, we're not certain of any of the dating of any of Hieronymus Bosch's work. This one is approximately dated 1475. Now, the peripheral panels, right? The seven deadly sins are in the central wheel, if you will. The peripheral panels dramatize what waits in the afterlife for those who either seek redemption or those who allow their sins to damn their immortal souls. Here is one of Bosch's depictions of hell. These four peripheral panels look forward to Bosch's masterpiece, a work of art that all of you have seen at some point in time, The Garden of Earthly Delights. Bosch did not title this work. The Garden of Earthly Delights is a modern title that was affixed to the triptych. It was completed somewhere between 1490 and 1510, when Bosch was somewhere between the ages of 40 and 60 years old. I know that's quite a wide span, but an accurate biography of Bosch is impossible to put together today. The triptych is painted in oil on oak panels and is formed from a square middle panel flanked by two other oak rectangular wings that close over the center as shutters. So when it was closed, it looked like this. The exterior shutters, closed, show the world during creation, probably on the third day of creation, according to the Old Testament, after the addition of plant life, but before the appearance of animals and humans. Then, if you open the two panels to the interior, the three scenes of the inner triptych are probably, but not necessarily, intended to be read chronologically from left to right. So we're moving from the Garden of Eden to the contemporary world at the center, to the hell that awaits us all. The left panel of the triptych, don't strain your eyes, I've got close-ups here for you, depicts the paradise of Eden, and there is God, a graven image indeed, presenting it to Adam and Eve with its many wondrous animals. And note the peaceful nature of all the animals, although I do see some predation going on at the bottom of this panel. I guess it's not Eden if you're a rat. The earthly delights, with numerous nudes in action on the central panel, which presents a broad panorama of socially engaged nude figures, fantastical animals, oversized fruit, hybrid stone formations, and depictions of fantastic punishments of the various sinners in hell, wraps up the triptych on the right-hand panel. Now, these paintings, especially the hell painting, are painted in comparatively sketchy manner, which contrasts with the traditional Flemish school of painting that was popular at the time, in which a smooth surface achieved by the application of multiple transparent glazes conceals the brushwork. In this painting and others, Bosch was drawing with his brush, right? He was spurning the Flemish school of painting, and he was essentially cartooning, which is part of why I embraced Bosch for this particular lecture tonight. This hellscape is without a doubt the most famous of all Bosch's works. It continues to be seen everywhere. I've seen it used in commercials, on LP records, on CD covers, advertising, including an insurance ad, movie title sequences, etc. But Bosch meant it to be read in its totality from left to right, and each panel was essential to the meaning of the whole. And even though this is the best known of Bosch's works, he did many others that have survived. There are at least two other major Hieronymus Bosch triptychs that have survived. The Last Judgment, which was painted sometime after 1482, and The Hay Wain from 1516. Each of these three works presents distinct yet linked themes addressing history and faith. Triptychs from this period were generally intended to be read sequentially, with the left and right panels often portraying Eden and the Last Judgment, respectively, while the main subject of each triptych dominated the central piece. So this, if you will, was a form of proto-comics. Contemporary cartoonists and graphic novelists continue to draw directly from Bosch's triptych. I know I did when I was penciling the hell issues of Saga of the Swamp Thing. For instance, this is a Marvel Comics page drawn by the late, great Russ Heath. This is a page from Marvel Comics' Son of Satan, February 1977. And Bosch's work, and indeed this whole period of medieval and post-medieval religious art, echoes through the work of many, many, many contemporary cartoonists, everyone from Robert Crumb to Gary Panter and beyond. All right, let's take a look at the first big print industry of proto-comics, the European broadsheets. Google, if you will, the name Erasmus of Formia, F-O-R-M-I-A, and read of his sainthood and the tortures that Saint Erasmus endured. This is one of the earliest known broadsheet printed comic strips, The Tortures of Saint Erasmus. It dates from 1455. And what it documents are Saint Erasmus's agonies during the 3rd century rule of the Emperor Diocletian. Depicted herein, so that you don't strain your eyes, is the metal scraping of Erasmus's bones, the breaking of his teeth, his entrails being wound out on a windlass, and finally, his beheading, the only torture the angels could not cure. Religious medieval art also informed the various editions of the Dance of the Dead. Each of them was essentially graphic albums, if you will, reveling in sin, death, and morality. One of the most famous was this edition from 1538, published in book form, with 82 plates printed from 41 woodcuts with 2 illustrations on each woodcut. This was created by the artist Hans Holbein the Younger. The 16th to 18th century comic format broadsheets were sold to Europeans of all classes. These ran anywhere from 1 to 4 pages, and many of the ones that have survived bring the medieval obsessions with sin, death, and retribution into very immediate focus. In that, many of these broadsheets were created to be sold at the executions of criminals. Sometimes the crimes of those criminals would be depicted in the broadsheet being sold at the criminal's execution. This 1572 broadsheet documented the revenge exacted by a man who had been slapped. Here's a translation of the title, which tells you everything you need to know. Quote, "The horrible murder committed in famous Hall, Saxony, by Christoph Windt from Zangen, who miserably killed his master, Victor of Schnetzien, with a smith's hammer for no reason, and how he was brought to electoral Mainz, sentenced there, and executed." The translations of the titles of these will tell you everything. Quote, "News of the unprecedented, horrible, and unnatural actions and crimes of certain grave diggers in the Principality of Silesia, and how they were executed on September 20th, 1606, unquote. This visualizes the confessions of 8 convicted murderers, and their crimes included necrophilia, cutting open pregnant women to remove and devour their fetal infants. Quote, "They were punished by having their breasts and thumbs tweaked off, hands severed, while the necrophiliac was castrated," unquote. And finally, in the final panel, all of them were burned at the stake. These were rough times to live in. Now, some of these surviving broadsheets are political propaganda, okay? And just as in contemporary times, often various political factions will use news accounts of atrocities to try to whip up their base. That is how many of these broadsheets functioned as well. This is the nature of the broadsheets and the evolution of the broadsheets. Roughly speaking, in the 16th century, broadsheets detailed the punishments. A century later, in the 17th century, both the crime and the punishments were depicted. And by the 18th century, it was only the lurid crimes that mattered. Some of these, as I said, had political intent, like this one. This is from 1655, and it's a classic of the form. It's intended to foment anger and outrage among anyone who lays eyes on it. Quote, "The horrible, cruel murder and persecution of the Vaudois in Piedmont," and it is credited to a Dutch artist named Joducius Hondius. Now, don't strain your eyes. I'm going to zoom in on some of the panels, which you may or may not thank me for. Quote, "In the village of Tellerat, a dozen different atrocities are committed upon 150 women and children. Some they roast and eat their hearts. Others are cut into pieces." Quote, "Many hang torn apart, cut in two down the middle, gaping bodies filled with salt and gunpowder and set alight," unquote. Quote, "They cut off the children's heads before their parents' eyes and play bowls with them," unquote. Now, a particularly successful broadsheet like this one would then lead to a reprinting of the broadsheet done by a different artist. And in each version of the broadsheet of the same atrocity, the atrocities got more and more vicious. This is a different, much more lavishly illustrated broadsheet rendition of the same event, published the very same year, 1655, offering further details of the atrocities, real or imagined, we have no idea. Quote, "The enemy roasts the brains of the children upon grills," unquote. Quote, "They roll the heads upon the floor," unquote. Quote, "They fill the women's sex with stones," unquote. And at the center of this broadsheet was a text printed large, quote, "See religion ever weeping for the pitiless shedding of innocent blood," unquote. Now, I don't want you to think that the evolution of the broadsheet form, much like comic books, if you track the evolution of comic books from, say, the 1930s to the present day, it's not like the artists and the writers got better over time, right? the skill level of each individual artist or writer or team doing the broadsheets was entirely dependent upon the skills of those individual creative people. Though many artists refined the form, many broadsheets remain very crude and simplistic, as evidenced by this French broadsheet, quote, "The Execution of Damiens," unquote, from 1757. This is a century after the one I just showed you. This was drawn and published, as today, it was all dependent on the skills of the artists involved. Okay, but there were some artists who stand out, and there's individual artists that really pushed the proto-comics form to a whole new level. And one of them, very prominent, is William Hogarth. Hogarth refined the broadsheet industry via his narrative prints, which he considered, quote, "modern moral works," unquote, and he refined them into an art form. The same fascination with gruesome crime and even more gruesome punishment was a staple of Hogarth's punitive morality tracts, which were indeed sequential narratives. These are proto-comics, and arguably among the most sophisticated of their time. So let me just share with you one very famous 4-panel William Hogarth broadsheet. This is the 4 Stages of Cruelty. We even know when it was printed and distributed, February 1st, 1751, using copper engravings. And I will zoom in on each of these 4 images for you, which again, you may or may not thank me for. The main protagonist of this series of 4 images is Tom Nero, who starts out in the care of the parish of St. Gilles in the Fields, the same location represented in Gin Lane. While Gin Lane, which was one of the broadsheet series by William Hogarth, showed a gin drinking and its consequences as being an epidemic, here we see another, albeit related, social epidemic, that of wanton cruelty. In his autobiographical notes, William Hogarth himself tells us that the images were, quote, "done in the hopes of preventing, in some degree, that cruel treatment of poor animals, which makes the streets of London more disagreeable to the human mind than anything whatever, the very describing of which gives pain," unquote. All right, let's look at the 4 stages of cruelty. This is a moral tract. I remind you, no actual animals were injured in the creation of these prints. These are drawings by William Hogarth. The first stage of cruelty. This street scene shows a group of youths, almost all of whom are participating in or encouraging the abuse of various animals and birds. Boys are seen tying a bone to a dog's tail. Another group are cauterizing the eyes of a bird, and so on. I won't detail all of them, but the worst abuse is being inflicted by Nero, who pushes an arrow into the anus of a terrified dog being held by 2 other boys. Another youth is distressed by what Nero is doing and attempts to stop him by offering a tart. To the left of Nero, a boy draws a hanged man on the wall and points to him, underlining the inevitable, that Nero's behavior will deteriorate further and cost Nero his life. This is a moral tract. Also note dogs being the most frequently pictured animals in here, which is going to become a key story point in the final image. This scene, the second plate, suggests that the abuse of animals is widespread in the streets of London. And on the left, we see Nero, who is now a grown adult, beating his horse because the poor creature has collapsed under the strain of a too heavily loaded cart. This is overladen with 4 lawyers who are too penny pinching to hire 2 carts and insensitive to the pain they are inflicting on the horse. On the left, there is a poster displayed near the door of a coffee house, which advertises Broughton's Amphitheater, which was a well-known venue for boxing. James Field and George Taylor are named in the caption below. They were celebrated boxers of the day. Most importantly to William Hogarth's moral tract, Field was hanged for highway robbery 11 days before Hogarth's print was published, thus establishing an interrelationship between violent sports, violent entertainment, and real-life cruelty to animals. Well, plate 3, Nero has embarked on a life of highway robbery. He is seen here being apprehended after committing the murder of a woman in the dead of night. Hogarth underlines the reality of being a highwayman being very far from the glamorous romantic existence presented by popular heroes such as Captain Macheath in The Beggar's Opera and other highwaymen characters who popped up in the Penny Dreadfuls of the day. Indeed, Nero's grotesque appearance, he's the bald man turning his head away from the body as he's being held, conveys the inherent viciousness of his character and the brutalizing way of life. His victim, who is named in the caption at the bottom, Anne Gill, was his lover and partner in crime, and she lays prostrate on the floor. Her throat has been cut. Her swollen stomach makes it clear she was pregnant at the moment of her death. And let's end with the reward of cruelty. As a piece of propaganda, this macabre image was calculated to de-romanticize criminality and its consequences. What Hogarth is illustrating here is the Cutlerian Theater near Newgate Prison, where medical students could study the cadavers. Nero has been hanged at the Tyburn, and as was the case with other executed criminals, his body is being dissected for the purpose of studying anatomy. The chief surgeon sits on the center in a high-backed chair with the royal coat of arms hanging above. Thus, he resembles a high court judge. This neatly represents the official process of judgment and punishment, which in the case of hanged criminals could extend beyond death itself. The skeletons of various other dissected criminals were usually refused a Christian burial and subsequently displayed as specimens, as can be seen in the niches at the top left and top right. And most importantly here, note the sophistication of William Hogarth's storytelling. At the bottom of the image, a dog eats Nero's heart. Payback for the animal cruelty he inflicted as a child. Now,
this image was this image was shown in From Hell in one chapter, that Hogarth piece, the last one that you showed. So is there any story behind that depiction in From Hell by Alan Moore?
I'm sorry, I misunderstood the question. I didn't hear it all.
That Hogarth piece showing dissection was
Yes.
shown in a page From Hell. So is there a story behind why Alan Moore chose that in his
well,
chapter?
you have to understand, William Hogarth's work is probably some of the best known, illustrated artwork from the period of time that Hogarth was working. So I'm sure, I don't have to say I'm sure. I know, because of the 10 years that I worked with Alan and we were friends, that Alan was very familiar with William Hogarth's work. And he, in fact, had a couple of volumes of Hogarth's artwork in his home library, just as I do. These scans, good or bad as they may be, are taken directly from some of the books I've got in my library. So Alan, as well as probably every comic book artist and writer in the UK, is very familiar with Hogarth's work. And this particular work, The 4 Stages of Cruelty, is very, very well known. The most popular of Hogarth's work, which has popped up in other comics and in a number of films, is The Rake's Progress, which is a less graphically violent and grotesque pathological narrative by William Hogarth. Now, these early European broadsheets that I've been showing you, and Hogarth's modern moral works, there's a reason I've exposed your brain to this horrible stuff tonight. They share the moral imperatives of almost all the 20th century and many of the 21st century American crime comics. And as an example, I share with you the cover of Shock Suspense Stories number 14, a very vivid cover by Wally Wood. This is from 1953. And the same imperative applies to 20th century and 21st century American horror comics and horror comics from around the world. Most of them are moral tracts of one kind or another. Someone is depicted either as a protagonist or antagonist. Horrible things occur due to human agency or supernatural agency, and any human being who walks the path of cruelty will end up paying dearly for having walked that path. Although the latter the 20th century and 21st century horror comics require a potent and decisive addition of fantastic elements necessary to the first true horror comics in Western culture, which upped the emotional ante. For instance, I started the talk tonight with Francesco Goya. Over a century after William Hogarth's sequential narrative moral works, Francesco Goya combined Hogarth's skill set with truly terrifying at times fantasy imagery to create his own seminal proto-graphic novels, as in Los Caprichos from 1799. This is the narrative work that the Sleep of Reason plate was part of. At the time that he did this artwork, Goya was recovering from a serious illness, and he crafted this remarkable sequential series of prints to caricature the way he saw the degeneration of Spanish society at the time, a people that he thought had abandoned all reason, depicted by Goya throughout Los Caprichos as a hideous procession of witches, asses, and devils. But that aspect of the fantastic was up in a lot of my favorite proto-comics predating the 20th century. For instance, fantastic retribution figured in many broadsheets from many cultures. I haven't shown you anything from Russia yet, so let's go to Russia. This is an 18th century Russian strip. Translated, it reads, "An ox, no longer wishing to remain an ox, became a butcher," unquote. This establishes a genre tradition of fantastic moral retribution, and it's the foundation of almost all 20th century horror comics, from the black humor of the EC pre-code tradition to cartoonists like Charles Addams and Dan Wilson. It also anticipated what came to be known as topsy-turvy in some cultural circles, a genre which exploded after the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species in November of 1849. On the Origin of Species sent shockwaves through Western civilization, and partly because it was considered a blasphemous work by many, but it also sent out shockwaves because it sort of placed us in the food chain. And it also proposed in the articulation of Darwin's theories that there were periods in geological history where we and our predecessors were at the bottom of the food chain, not at the top of the food chain. And that's what these kind of fantastical proto-comics definitely do. Now, this Russian comic, "An ox no longer wishing to remain an ox became a butcher," is a direct predecessor to this Charles Addams cartoon. This is from 1942, published in the New Yorker. It does not have a caption, but if it did, maybe the caption would read, "A moose, no longer wishing to be a moose, became a hunter." Or this Dan Wilson cartoon from the 1960s. "Ed, run, it's a trap." This is a Dan Wilson cartoon that, again, puts us at the bottom of the food chain, but it's also a direct one-panel humorous cartoon precursor to an entire underground comic that lasted 3 issues that was called Insect Fear. This is a cover by Spain Rodriguez from the second issue, published in 1970. And as you can see, we're back at the bottom of the food chain. This became a genre when it was called topsy-turvy. It thrived in European comics of the late 19th and early 20th century. Founded in January 1882, the French magazine Le Chat Noir, the Black Cat, drew its name in part from the famous Edgar Allan Poe story, The Black Cat. And it featured comic strips along with political satire articles and fantasy fiction. Prominent among its artistic contributors was Theophile Alexandre Steinlen, frequently referred to as just Steinlen. He lived from November 10th, 1859 to December 13th, 1923. This Steinlen strip, entitled What Befell a Little Girl, dates from 1885. Here's another Steinlen. This is from around the same period, and these were enormously successful. Now, 19th century American and England cultivated their own print industries. These were not comic books, but they were templates for many aspects of the comic book industry of the 20th century. In England, from the 1860s onward, what were called penny dreadfuls thrived. The term penny dreadful was inherently pejorative. Just as cheap cigars were called penny stinkers, so the penny dreadfuls were cheap, nasty novels. They came out weekly, and they reveled in sensationalism and brutality. Many of the penny dreadfuls featured characters no longer remembered today. Anybody here remember the Blue Dwarf? Anybody? Not getting any yells. But I'm willing to bet some of you might remember Spring-Heeled Jack. These were characters seemingly torn from the 19th century headlines. Spring-Heeled Jack, as Kevin Carpenter stated in his book, his History of the Penny Dreadfuls, quote, "There was a general agreement amongst teachers, clergymen, magistrates, and journalists that the penny dreadful glorified crime, that its boy readers were tempted into a life of degradation and theft, that the amount of this garbage on the market was enormous, and that some kind of suppression should be placed on these publications," unquote. At their peak, the penny dreadfuls sold 250,000 copies per week per title. Passed from hand to hand, loaned, it's sure that it was read by many, many, many more than 250,000 readers. Some of these penny dreadful characters we do remember today. First popularized as a folk boogeyman in the penny dreadfuls, and soon to appear as a character on stage, were Sweeney Todd. Now, the penny dreadfuls and their crime-obsessed American counterparts, which we called over here the dime novels, established the basis of the industrial age's most lurid pop literature. From the base tone of much of that literature, engaging in a sort of manufactured urgency, the flagrant excess of its texts and imagery, and the very cheap production and creative labor feeding cut-price retail to pay the least amount possible and sell the work for the least amount possible. This is the basis of what became the 20th century comic book industry. Now, women as well as men worked to fill the pages of the penny dreadfuls. Among the most popular artists of the form was a woman named Mary Byfield. At the top is one of Mary's illustrations entitled "The Midnight Assassination." It accompanied a story in which a young Irish couple were haunted by the ghost of a murder victim. And at the bottom is a Mary Byfield illustration that accompanied not a narrative story, but an article entitled "There is a Skeleton in Every House," which was an essay on family jealousy and murder. Among the most persistent critics of the penny dreadfuls and dime novels was Anthony Comstock. I won't spend too much time with Anthony Comstock because he's not central to the evolution we're going to be carrying, but I will note for you that there is a terrific book that just came out last year in 2021 called "The Man Who Hated Women." And it is a biography of Anthony Comstock and a chronology of his practices. A provision in the 1865 Post Office Bill made it a misdemeanor, a crime, to send, quote, "any obscene book, pamphlet, picture, print, or other publication of vulgar and indecent character," unquote, through the American mail system. After Anthony Comstock moved to New York City, which was the hub of America's commercialized sex industry, Comstock went on the offensive. His activities culminated in the March 2nd, 1873 establishment of the Comstock Law, which forbade the sending through the mails of, quote, "any drug or medicine or any article whatever for the prevention of contraception," unquote, the prevention of conception, pardon me. And the Comstock Act was amended in 1876. And basically, Comstock used his power as the American head of the post office to suppress and regulate any feminist activity, any attempts to practice birth control, any attempts to educate about birth control, and so on. This also led to Comstock outlawing a lot of the kind of publications that were selling in various retail venues at the time. Meanwhile, in Mexico, an artist named Jose Guadalupe Posada, Posada, who lived from 1851 to 1913, He was a Mexican engraver, illustrator, and activist, and he was very well known in Mexico for his satirical and politically pointed calaveras. Posada was a pioneer folk artist whose prints, pamphlets, posters, and tabloids brimmed with Black humor. Derived from the Spanish word for skulls, these calaveros were illustrations featuring anthropomorphized skeletons, which would, after Posada's death, become closely associated with the Mexican holiday Dia los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. We see almost all our Mexican restaurants now in the 21st century adorned with various permutations of the kind of artwork that Posada popularized during his lifetime. Most of these were actually published by the press of Antonio Venegas Arroyo. Arroyo produced inexpensive literature for the lower classes, including thousands of satirical broadsides, and it was these satirical broadsides that Posada favored illustrating. Through this focus on mortality, Arroyo and Posada satirized many poignant issues of the day, in particular the details of the life of the rich and the dictatorship of Diaz. On January 20th, 1913, 3 years after the start of the Mexican Revolution, Jose Guadalupe Posada died in his home. He died obscure, unknown, penniless. He was buried in an unmarked grave. However, by the 1920s, his work was discovered, reprinted, and he was championed by the French expatriate artist Jean Charlotte, who described Posada, quote, as the printmaker to the Mexican people, unquote. This is also the era of proto-comics being used as a journalistic art form, a way of illustrating the news of the day. Prior to photogravure technology making it possible to cheaply reproduce photographs, newspapers and tabloids and daily and weekly publications had to rely upon cartoonists to illustrate the news of the day. Henry Fox Talbot was the man who developed the process of photogravure printing, refining it in the 1850s, patenting it in 1852 as photographic engraving, and again in 1858 in a refined form as photoglyphic engraving. But prior to that, cartoonists and proto-comics were used, particularly in the 19th century European newspapers, and particularly to report sensationalist crimes of the day. These were an extension then of those European broadsheets that I showed you a few moments ago. Among the crimes reported in the form of proto-comics in 1888 London were the horrific, gruesome, never solved murders committed by the enigmatic criminal who named himself Jack the Ripper. All of the early depictions and reporting of the Jack the Ripper murders were illustrated with this kind of proto-cartooning, proto-comics. These newspapers popularized the news, the rumors, the instant myth-making at work in these still unsolved murders. This is from November 17th, 1888. So you can see the comic format headline and the detailed comics format report. Prominent among an era studied with sensationalistic crimes and societal upset and eruptions, the Jack the Ripper murders reverberated through history. And indeed, I focus on them tonight because I want to show you how those murders carried over into every print technology revolution and every new printed form of popular culture. The dime novels, the penny dreadfuls, the halfpenny dreadfuls of the late 19th and early 20th century, right on through to the 20th century pop culture, including pulps, radio dramas, television, movies, comic books, graphic novels. Consider just one story, Robert Bloch's Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper, which embodied the 20th century image of Jack the Ripper as a supernatural boogeyman that never dies, whose spirit can leap from body to body. So he is constantly incarnated and still killing into the present day. Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper by Robert Bloch debuted in the pulp Weird Tales in 1943. It was adapted almost immediately to radio on a program called Stay Tuned for Terror. It was adapted to television. It was one of the episodes of the Boris Karloff hosted TV series Thriller in 1961. And then Robert Bloch himself scripted the Star Trek episode, which carried it into the future and outer space in the episode Wolf in the Fold. This became the archetype for an entire subgenre of serial killer fiction, indeed popularized before the term serial killer had even been coined, in which murderous sacrifices perpetuate a killer's immortality. This is the Marvel adaptation of Robert Bloch's story. This was published by Marvel in Journey into Mystery in 1971, and it reached its fullest fruition, if you will, in Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell's From Hell, which was serialized from 1989 to 1999. It took Alan and Eddie 10 years and 4 different publishing models to complete the serialization. Okay, we're almost to our end. I want to conclude tonight with one artist. There's any number of comic strips and comic strip artists I could have chosen, but the one I chose to bring to your attention to wrap up this lecture is Winsor McCay. Winsor McCay was born in 1867. Well, we're not sure. Maybe he was born in 1869. Wait, it might have been 1871. One of those years Winsor McCay was born in Canada. Wait, no, maybe not Canada. He might have been born in Spring Lake, Michigan. This is all a matter of dispute as to where and when Winsor McCay was actually born. We do know, though, in all sources, that from boyhood, he had an interest in drawing from the moment that he could hold a pen. His father was a real estate agent, and his father encouraged young Winsor to become a businessman. However, McCay left school at the age of 21, and he went to work at the National Printing Company in Chicago, where he illustrated posters for circuses and did other promotional artwork. That's what he loved, and that's where he chose to make his living. Winsor moved to Cincinnati at the age of 23. He created advertising posters and worked as a billboard painter before becoming a cartoonist / reporter for the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune. He also freelanced as an illustrator for other magazines and newspapers. In 1903, Winsor McCay produced sort of an experimental comic strip that was entitled Tales of the Jungle Imps by Felix Fiddle. It was based on poems by George Chester. At the end of 1903, McCay was being courted by the New York Herald, and he promptly moved his family to New York City, Big Apple, and began experimenting with his own original strips. So let's take a look at some of his strips. This is Little Sammy Sneeze from the New York Herald, 1904. Here we are in 1904, the beginning of American comic strips. Here's Winsor McCay doing the first formalist deconstructionist comic, inventing the very comic structure that he was gleefully deconstructing at the same time. This is the kind of stuff that Art Spiegelman and Scott McCloud were doing in much more recent decades. McCay is laying the groundwork in his comic strips for the newspapers. Little Sammy Sneeze was followed by the much more popular Dream of a Rarebit Fiend. And for those of you who don't know what rarebit is, it's kind of a quiche-like, heavy cheese-based pie, okay? Dream of the Rarebit Fiend was done for the New York Telegram, and the title refers to the fact that people believed at this time that if you ate rarebit too close to bedtime, you'd have bad dreams. Well, dedicated to that proposition, Winsor wrote and illustrated a lot of imaginary bad dreams in this strip. The New York Telegram, by the way, was owned by the New York Herald, so Dream of a Rarebit Fiend appeared in more than one newspaper. Here, McCay sharpened his pen with a procession of incredibly experimental weekly strips, which essentially invented the entire vocabulary of 20th century comics, right? Here he is working with an 8-panel grid, a very formal structure, and the entire dream revolves around the dreamer being caught in a tilted reality that then parallels their being not just crushed on the train, but having fallen out of bed. Brilliant composition. Dream of the Rarebit Fiend was so popular, and as I speak to you about McCay and Dream of the Rarebit Fiend, I leave it to you to read these strips. It was so popular that it was adapted into a live-action film, and there was talk of producing a Broadway musical, which, as best we know, did not end up hitting the stage. The editor of the New York Herald wanted to separate his work for the two papers that they owned, the Herald and the Telegram. So McKay's contract would now allow him to sign his real name to the dream strips, which is why Dreams of the Rarebit Fiend is signed Silas. That was his pen name. Okay, here's a strip I am going to walk through with you, pun intended, walk through. Occasionally, McKay's humor streams segued into really nightmarish extremes: monsters, deformation, mutation, dismemberment, decay, even premature burial, which I'm going to share with you as we end tonight, made McKay strip the grandfather of all the American horror comics to come. Forever experimenting with the potential and possibilities of the medium, McKay would exaggerate and thereby parody common fears, as in this dreamer's misfortune. Now, this is at a time when American cities were moving from horse and buggy to more and more mechanized transportation. And yet, as you can see here, horse and buggy is still dangerous enough that the first accident, this man trying to cross the street suffers dismemberment because of a horse and carriage. And then the various vehicles that are going to further dismember him become larger and larger until it's a streetcar and an automobile that take him out. What's amazing about these strips is, I mean, these are really graphic, but by eschewing any gore whatsoever, there's no blood spilled in any of these strips. McKay gets away with it. This was published in family newspapers without any problem. He also got away with it because every strip ended with, well, it was a dream, so none of that was real. So how could anyone object to this? It's an approach to cartooning that later sophisticated venues for cartooning, like the New Yorker, also adopted. This is one of the most famous of all the James Thurber cartoons, a very pitch black piece of humor by James Thurber. This is from the New Yorker, 1932. Reportedly a drawing rescued from James Thurber's wastepaper basket, although that may be apocryphal. Touché is the caption. Now, this kind of goreless dismemberment is very different from the kind of dismemberment that became vivid in the EC pre-code horror comics. This is a Johnny Craig Vault of Horror cover from the spring of 1953. But, you know, EC Comics had a lot of competitors. EC Comics Vault of Horror, Haunt of Fear, and Tales from the Crypt sold very well. So every other publisher had their horror comic out there. But they weren't willing always to go as far as EC Comics on their cover, yielding real masterpieces like one of my all-time favorites, Bring Back My Feet. Okay, here's one of my favorite Dream of the Rarebit Fiend strips, not just because it's rather ghoulish and macabre. This is from February 25th of 1905. But I also love it because it's one of McKay's most inventive and genuinely chilling subjective point of view dreams. At this time in America, 1905, embalming was not a common process. Undertaking and the way that our culture dealt with the deceased was still evolving. It had not yet been industrialized that it was the way it was later in the 20th century. So fear of premature burial was a very, very real fear when this strip was published in 1905. And yet here's a strip presented entirely from the point of view of the victim. Our protagonist is the one whose wrist is being held up. Yep, his pulse is at a standstill. He's a goner, doc. We might as well notify his widow. From what I hear, she won't be sorry. He was a high liver. Then we see the grieving relatives and the not so grieving relatives. Oh, why did you die without leaving me even 5 cents? I'm glad you're gone. You led me an awful life. It was coming to you. It's too bad that he should go without some little preparation. Yes. And then the circular view plate in the coffin itself. The booze that he has put away would float a ship. He's heavy, isn't he? Oh, I'll make you forget him. He was no good. He was a brute. Mary, I love you. I always did think more of you, come to think of it. He looks natural, but who wouldn't with that alcohol that's in him? Death in this case is a blessing not only to his wife, but to the whole community. He was absolutely no good. He owed me nothing but money. Well, at last my hopes are realized. He's where he belongs. He'll make good fuel. If I were you, madam, I should build a pyramid of stone on this grave, bigger than the ones in Egypt, or he'll come back. Dust to dust, requiescent and passe. Now, this is amazing for a 1905 comic strip, right? Point of view, right to the point of the first shovelful of dirt hitting the top of the coffin, and then the wake up and redemption. Now, this is unflinching fidelity that McKay presents to the first person point of view, right down to that penultimate panel. But what amazes me about this strip is how it echoes not just through comics history, but also through cinema, okay? Again, this strip was from February 25th, 1905, and yet in the Danish film by Carl Dreyer, Vampire, from 1931, there's an entire sequence where the protagonist dreams of being buried alive, and much of it is shown through the glass faceplate of the coffin, right to the moment where the vampire of the title, an old woman, is seen peering down into the coffin faceplate, holding a candle that drips wax down onto the faceplate. Even more vivid, an extrapolation on that Winsor McCay, is this pre-code EC horror comic story that appeared in the Vault of Horror number 34, cover date December 1953, January 1954. It was a story by Johnny Craig, and Johnny Craig wrote and drew his own stories for EC. It was called Starlight, Star Bright, and this is the final page. Right to the penultimate panel, the caption reads, "And then a shovel full of dirt hit him flush in the face." Did Johnny Craig read? Did he know of this Winsor McCay comic? I don't know. These strips had not been reprinted at that time. You couldn't go to a bookstore or go online and buy a reprint edition of Dream of the Rarebit Fiend. But I look at this Johnny Craig page and it's like, oh my God, you know, was he working from a memory? Had somebody told him about the McCay strip? Or is this just how visual media evolves? That you don't even have to have seen what came before you. Some ideas are just so good, so natural, that they reappear again and again and again in visual media. We're not going to know. Much of what McCay did in Rarebit is echoed throughout the history of international comics and international media. The most popular of them, of course, being Dream of the Rarebit Fiend from January 28, 1905, which captured a common dream component, the dream about flying, specifically here, flying in one's bed. And this anticipated the most celebrated creation of Winsor McCay, Little Nemo and Slumberland, where almost every Little Nemo adventure would begin with Nemo going to bed, and in this case, the bed becoming an animated living being that begins walking around the city. Now, McCay started Little Nemo and Slumberland in 1905, the same year that he concluded Dream of the Rarebit Fiend, and it became an instantly popular strip. This was made into a Broadway musical, and the strip is considered to this day McCay's masterpiece. McCay constantly challenged himself too as an artist. I mean, he was drawing this every week. And every week that he was drawing Little Nemo and Slumberland, he was also doing editorial cartooning for William Randolph Hearst, his publisher. In fact, William Randolph Hearst didn't want McCay to be doing these Sunday comics anymore at a certain point. He felt that McCay's editorial cartooning was so powerful and so able to shape public opinion that he wanted McCay to give up on these silly experiments and just focus on editorial cartooning. But McCay wanted to be doing this. Look at the perspective drawing and how vivid these sequences are, the use of proportion and size and shape. Oh my God. I mean, some of these architectural renderings, I couldn't do this in 4 weeks if you held a gun to my head. He was doing this every week on top of his other work. McCay's popularity increased and he began performing on vaudeville while keeping up on his deadlines for Hearst. His first vaudeville act consisted of speed drawing various characters, including popular characters from his strip. At the same time, McKay was still producing several daily strips and editorial cartoons. After 8 years, hundreds of editorial cartoons, and 7 strips, McKay left the New York Tribune and then went to work for William Randolph Hearst at the New York American. And his arrival was very publicized, heralded event. Now, while he was doing Little Nemo in Slumberland, McKay was also hand drawing his own animated cartoons at the same time. While working for Hearst, McKay began to experiment with the idea of using animated pictures as part of his vaudeville act. His first attempt was made using the Little Nemo characters. It was a huge success, and it captivated audiences everywhere that he went. He would go on stage, introduce the work, show the animated cartoon, interact with the cartoon, speak to the characters, timing the animated action for that kind of live interplay. He followed that experiment with How a Mosquito Operates, and that again was a success. And then in 1914, debuting in February of that year, McKay introduced Gertie the Dinosaur. Rather than just showing the film as he had with his previous attempts, McKay actually interacted with Gertie on stage, giving her great life and charm. Gertie was an instant success and the first original character developed solely for the animated cartoon, not based on pre-existing comic strip characters. Now, Hearst was getting pissed about all this. He felt that McKay's vaudeville act was taking valuable time away from the newspaper work that Hearst wanted him to be doing. And since McKay was under contract, Hearst eventually forbade McKay from making any more live performance appearances outside of New York. He could continue the vaudeville presentations in New York, but he couldn't travel to Chicago, Baltimore, or elsewhere. Gertie was then made into a self-standing film with a filmed live action prologue and epilogue, and that's how it traveled around the world. And that's the version of Gertie that you can watch online today or buy on Blu-ray or DVD. Hearst eventually forbid entirely McKay doing any live vaudeville-related performances, and then forbade McKay doing his daily comic strips. McKay was only to draw editorial cartoons. Okay, so let's go back to Dream of the Rarebit Fiend before I finish tonight. This is the March 8th, 1905 installment of Dream of the Rarebit Fiend, and this inspired McKay's 1921 animated film entitled The Pet, which you can go and watch online. It's on YouTube. It's called The Pet. If you go on YouTube and type in McKay, The Pet, it'll bring it up. It is the first ever giant monster attacking a city motion picture ever made. So if you're a fan of King Kong, if you're a fan of Godzilla, if you're a fan of Ray Harryhausen and Willis O'Brien the way I am, it all starts with this Winsor McKay comic strip from March 8th, 1905. A dream in which a wife convinces her husband that they should take in this vagrant pet that has wandered in, and yet the pet begins to grow impossibly. So they decide, well, we should poison it, put it out of its misery, put us out of its misery. But when they give it poison, it just keeps growing and growing. And anything they try to kill it, including gunfire, fire, sledgehammer, explosives, fail completely to kill the pet. And then they wake up with the puppy on the foot of the bed, the cause of the bad dream. So this dynamic, this imaginative premise of this wholly invented animal that begins looking like a strange dog at worst and grows into something quite monstrous is what became the Dream of the Rarebit Fiend animated cartoon, The Pet, in 1921. That animated cartoon was the precursor, as I say, to every giant monster movie or giant monster comic ever made. It anticipates the finale of the film version of The Lost World that Willis O'Brien did stop motion animation for in 1925. And if you want to find out more about that, go check our recorded archives of these lectures, the two-parter on dinosaurs and pop culture. This predates sound era giants like King Kong in 1932, the giant monster boom of the 1950s, the giant monster comics of the 1950s and 60s, drawn by people like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. McKay also did an animated cartoon in 1918 that William Randolph Hearst approved of that was called The Sinking of the Lusitania. It was one of the first animated cartoons to use cell technology, where instead of redrawing the background in every single drawing, McKay used translucent cells and just drew the original elements that would be animated. He could then repeat the painted elements that were behind the translucent cells, and then you paint opaque paint behind the cell, the aspect that's animated that you want to stand out over the painted background. Even when William Randolph Hearst opened his own animation studio, McKay continued to work on his own. He produced 6 more animated films through 1921, including this one, The Pet. McKay continued to draw editorial cartoons until his death by stroke on July 26, 1934. McKay was truly a multimedia artist, and as such, the role model for the most adventurous cartoonists of the 20th and 21st centuries. And that's why we end tonight with Winsor McKay. I can take questions now, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. Anybody, any questions? You
Thanks,
can either
Stephen.
put them on the chat.
That was often. Yeah, there's a question that John Ronan asked, and I'm going to go back. I'll go find it. He was asking about the Popish plot, I think. The illustrated thing, and I can't remember what it was called. It was
Francis Barlow, a true narrative of the horrid, hellish, popish plot. There are 4 different versions of it. It's right around the same time as Romain de Hoog was doing all of his comics and sequential serials in the Dutch Republic period. Seems to me that both Romain de Hoog and Claude Gillot and of course Barlow were extremely important to Hogarth.
Oh, most generally, definitely, John. In fact, you know, I leapfrogged to Hogarth, and I left out a whole, 2 generations of artists that predated Hogarth, just as I then leapfrogged and skipped over, artists like Rudolf Topfer and so on, who are critical to this chronology. Part of it's the time factor. I mean, you've all been here now for what, 2 hours. But you're right, John. I mean, there's a lot of other cartoonists and a lot of other key works, including Thomas Roylandson and Wilhelm Busch in Germany, following Rudolf Topfer's work in Europe. Wilhelm Busch would have been the next stage. Wilhelm Busch is the man who created Max and Moritz, which became the prototype for the Kassenjammer kids in early 20th century comic strips and so on. So yeah, you're right. Those are precursors. And it was sort of an arbitrary decision that I made. My focus, as you could sense, was I was trying to use the crime and punishment theme as being sort of the through line to cherry pick, okay, which works am I going to touch upon? This is in no way a definitive, all-encompassing history that I present to you at any point in any of these lectures.
And I was also sort of struck by the absence of Schoeffer.
Yeah,
I mean, that's probably the most important person to the development of comics, period.
Sure, I have a whole separate lecture about Topfer and Wilhelm Busch. I went with the lectures that the committee who chose my lectures went with here, and they did not choose the Topfer lecture. If we do this again, I don't know how well attended or useful these lectures are. Maybe, John, you could convince the group for me to include that lecture in the next series if we're doing the next series. So I love Topfer's work, and Rudolf Topfer, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's spelled Topffer. And Rudolf Topfer pretty much invented sequential narrative in the way we understand and use it today. And he was a practically blind cartoonist. In fact, his father was a portrait painter, a very successful portrait painter. And that was the calling that Rudolf wanted to follow, but his eyesight was too poor. And because his eyesight was so poor, he couldn't work with paints. He couldn't really see what he was doing. So he adopted pen and ink because he could see the line drawings that he was putting down. And he ended up making his living as a teacher. He and his wife started their own academy for boys. And when they would take trips around Europe, Topfer would come back from the trip and he would draw a satirical narrative based on the trip that he and his students had just taken. And he would
Yeah, the zigzags.
he would share those drawn narratives with his students. His students loved them so much that his students talked about him with other people. And eventually Topfer kind of built an audience without meaning to. Eventually his work began to appear in print. And some of the fascinating aspects about Topfer and the print technologies is he was drawing in pen and ink. When a publisher wanted to print them, they would have to pay an engraver to create an engraving of Topfer's work, which would then flop the work. It would reverse it. So panels where Topfer had action going from left to right so that it was leading the eye, suddenly those panels counterintuitively would have the characters moving from right to left. And it was only in later printings that new engravings were done by another artist working from Topfer's narratives, sticking absolutely to what he had drawn, but drawing them in a slightly more illustrative manner and matching his left to right page and panel orientation.
Because the original counterfeits that were published in the Parisian papers were so bad that the publisher hired Cham to redo them.
Right.
And Topfer then went back and redid his original work to expand it.
Exactly.
So he was very much concerned about people ripping them off. And of course, that's exactly what happened.
Now, the artist that John is referring to, Cham, C-H-A-M, this magnificent book from University Press of Mississippi. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, John, I think this came out like 2 years ago at most.
Yeah, that was Kunzel's work before his most recent one.
Right.
Yeah.
And Cham was sort of like Topfer's competitor until the publisher decided, well, I'm putting these two guys together.
Yeah.
And Cham became the popular interpreter of Topfer's work. So again, that's a whole, the only reason the exclusion happened, John, is that's a whole separate lecture because there's so much to discuss with Topfer's work.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, I get that. I get that.
And as you can see, I had the book without rehearsal. John did not tell me he was going to ask that question. And I could read right over to my bookshelf. And there's my Rudolf Topfer and my Cham. All my David Kunzel books are right over here in reach because David Kunzel, K-U-N-Z-L-E, I think he's the greatest archaeologist of proto-comics that we have.
Absolutely.
Thank God he's been doing these books. So
I just want to say I really appreciated the lecture and I enjoyed it. All the stuff you introduced us to. So thank you very much.
John, thank you. And again, I am sorry for the oversights, but as I said,
that's all right. That's all right. I was just interested why you chose this, or I guess that's it's a traditional jump is to go from Hogarth and then go to the Penny Dreadfuls. And
it's really a matter
of whoa, you just skipped over like 2/3 of my class.
It's really a matter of the time frame, and it's also a matter of which lectures the committee chose. I went with their decisions, and we all lived with it.
Thank you, Steve.
Further questions? Oh, John, we can't hear a word you're saying.
Yeah, I'm wondering, John, do you have your mute on your headphones on? There's a mute, a cough button.
Oh, well.
So Abu, you have a question. I see your hands up. So what is it you're thinking?
Okay.
Michael, I have two questions. So the first question is Hieronymus Bosch.
Yes.
Was it that was he influenced by Dante's Inferno? Did the book exist back then in his time, Dante's Inferno?
Well, I don't know. And part of the question, Abu, that none of us can answer is, could Bosch read? Okay. We don't know if a lot of these artists, an artist like Bosch made his living by going literally from church to church or from, sponsor to sponsor. In order to make his living. And you can imagine, Abu, how long it would take to paint one of those triptychs, right? And I often wonder if Bosch put so much detail into his work because you're eating while you're doing that work, right? The longer it takes for you to finish that work, the longer you've got room, board, and some food until they finally, the parish goes, listen, you've been here for 2 years. Get that damn painting done. But we don't know if Bosch could read. Now, I would have to look up, if anyone can look up and give us an answer, whether Dante's Inferno had been written or published at that time. I think Bosch predated Dante's Inferno, but
And Paradise Lost also by John Milton.
yeah, Milton,
Did
I think,
that
was
predate?
later. I'm pretty sure
Okay.
Milton was later. I mean, Bosch, Bosch is a very mysterious figure, and that book you held up, Abu, that is the book on Bosch that I own as well, and it has a great.
My mom's college work. My mom's college book from 1993.
That is a great book, and we still don't know a lot about Bosch's life, including key questions like, was he literate? Could he read? A lot of artists back then who made their living as painters could not read. The ones who could tended to be part of the church, because most of the educated people in villages would be connected to the local church. That's why illuminated manuscripts came into being, right? The same artist who was doing the calligraphy would also usually be doing the illustration, as far as we know. Bosch is the exception in that we actually have a name we can affix to a certain body of work. You had a second question, Abu.
Yeah. The second question was, did Winsor McCay use any assistants? Like it was
Yes.
very hectic, doing
Yes.
Sunday strips, doing the perspective. He might have used assistants. I mean, one man can't draw everything.
As far as I know from the biographies of McCay, he did not use assistants for the comics, but he did use assistants for the animated films. For instance, I have in my personal collection, I can't show it to you because it's upstairs. It's not down here where I'm seated. I have an original cell from Gertie the dinosaur. And the way I acquired that original cell from Gertie the dinosaur is I have a very good friend, Michael Berry, who owns a animation and art gallery in Virginia. And Michael found for me a Gertie cell. And he acquired that cell from a collection in California that was authorized as genuine because it was acquired from the man McCay had hired to repeat ink all the backgrounds in Gertie. Every cell, McCay would draw and ink Gertie, the woolly mammoth, the flying creature that goes overhead, anything moving, McCay would draw and ink. But Gertie is standing on like a plateau with a cave behind her, and there's a lake next to her that she drinks at one point. This guy had been hired, Abu, to ink perfectly and try to match the line work for every background element. And if you watch Gertie the dinosaur, you can see that all those elements sort of vibrate, because however carefully you trace them, there's going to be some microscopic difference. Exactly. But so that's my long answer to you to say that we know he had assistants working with him on the animated films, but I have never read any account that claimed or documented him having assistants on his comic strip work. Before he died, Winsor McCay, and he died of a stroke, so he didn't know that his passing was pending. He tried to sell a dinosaur strip called Dino to the syndicates under his son's name. And his son, Winsor was trying to groom his son to follow in his father's footsteps, but his son, didn't have the spark. He was a competent cartoonist, but I mean, my God, who could follow Winsor McCay?
Yeah.
What a shadow to grow up under. And I bring that up because you may find examples. There's a couple of the surviving Dino strips, and they are signed by his son. But that does not mean his son did them. Winsor wrote and drew them, and was trying to set that up as something his son could carry on, but it didn't work. They couldn't find a buyer.
All right, thank you, Abu. I think that'll be our last question. It's getting pretty late or early.
Yeah, we're up to 9:16.
So I'm good. Is it all right if I stop right here, Stephen? Because I think everyone's sort of
we're done.
Ready to be done. All right. So I would like to thank everyone for coming. It looks like John's not going to be able to be verbal, so I'll sort of close it down. So yeah, I would like to, I appreciate that, Stephen, it blew my mind again. I mean, I'm just enthralled with what you're talking about. So I totally dig all of this. I'd like to thank our sponsors. Tim Stairs is actually on right now. I can see
Thank you.
Tim actually made it. So Nostalgia Inc. is one of our sponsors for this and the next one. And so I thank him for that. We also have to thank the library because they've been sponsoring a lot of this, and of course, Jackson College. Stephen, you have any parting words before we say bye?
Next week will be, not next week, in 2 weeks, we're doing the comics technology lecture, which follows the method by which comics are printed and distributed. And I hope you'll enjoy that as well. It'll be a shorter lecture than tonight's. We had a lot of ground to cover tonight. And as you saw from the questions, there was a lot of ground left uncovered tonight. So,
oh, I thoroughly enjoyed it. All right. Well, I guess you can stop the recording, John, because I think you're in control of that.
I love this new mime, John.
Yeah, I know.
Maybe we should, Stephen, what do you think? Should we stay with mime,
exactly.
John?